Welcome everybody. We have today Moeletsi Mbeki at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, the Center for Business Ethics, and particularly its Anti-Corruption Coalition project. This is the first in our podcast series entitled Help Us to Understand. We will ask the views of our interviewees, not presenting GIBS views, of course. But first, Moeletsi, you're a household name in South Africa and beyond. Our audience knows you well, but there are some, hopefully many, who would like to be reminded and who haven't necessarily come across you before. You are a director of companies in the corporate world. You're a scholar, author, journalist, political analyst, weather history, a politician, and behind all that, of course, is someone who grew up in the struggle against apartheid and in a famous leading activist family. Tell us then about your own history, particularly how it was growing up in that family. Did you have the right to dissent, and how was it growing up?
Well, we were shopkeepers. We had a shop in the Transkei, which is now part of the Eastern Cape. We were part of the network of general dealerships in the Transkei, and my parents, who had been communists since the 1930s, they were at university in the 1930s, and they were in the Communist Party. So we had lots of books, and we had lots of discussions about what was going on in the country at the time. I remember my father who became a journalist, working on a magazine about straydom. I think that was my first political consciousness. Straydom this was a cartoon on the cover of a magazine, was being stung by bees. So that was one of my early memories of a political image, was this man called Straydom being stung by lots of bees. So obviously this was the bad guy getting the treatment that he deserved.
Your family had strong views, your mother, your father, your brother. We know about them. Did you have the right of dissent? Was there discussion, debate?
Yes, absolutely. We had every right of. Everyone had their views, and they still have their own views in my family. My sister, my late sister, was married to a man from the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, which of course was a breakaway group from our core group, which was the African National Congress. But nobody bothered about it.
And I presume it was that debate against the background of your journalistic and academic parents that developed strong views and educated, well, not educated, but informed views of the politics of the day.
Yes, my father in the 50s was editor of a newspaper called New Age, and we used to use our shop to distribute the New Age, which of course was full of propaganda against the National Party regime at the time.
If I may, by way of introduction, introduce the theme of our podcasts, and that is help us understand. If one looks at social media today, particularly social media, but beyond, political views tend to be absolute in their terms. There is no room for consideration, no room for dissent, no room for debate. It's either extreme praise on the one hand or extreme insult on the other. And our view is that this doesn't encourage learning. It does not encourage debate. It does not encourage a rational analysis of what's going on around us. And it, in a sense, inhibits sensible and creative solutions, sensible and creative thinking. Is that fair comment?
Yes, I think that's fair comment. One of the weaknesses of social media is that the people who write in social media, you don't know who they are. They don't use their names most of the time. So they're totally unaccountable and they can say whatever comes to their heads. So that is one of the weaknesses. However, social media does have strengths as well. So one shouldn't be too distracted by its weaknesses. It plays an important role in some of the debates that happen and in mobilizing people to be active, to come to the streets to demonstrate and so on. So it has pros and cons.
Well, our particular contribution hopefully will be to assist the ordinary citizens to understand, to reflect, and perhaps to themselves become active in seeking solutions to the problems that we face. And that's why you're here, objective, academic, and I've had the opportunity to look back at your books. I'd like to talk about your most recent book, if I may. That is authored by you and who?
My niece.
Is it your niece?
Yeah.
That's Nobantu.
Yeah.
Yes. It's entitled A Manifesto for Social Change, How to Save South Africa. In that, there is a core argument that is set out, and that is the nature of our own economy and its structure. That economy was built around, and we're talking many decades ago, what main features?
Well, the South African economy of today was built up by the British when they were the colonial power of South Africa. And it was built up 150 years ago with the discovery of the diamonds. So that the modern economy of South Africa dates back to 150 years ago, our present economy. It was really built on the discovery of the minerals, because soon after the discovery of gold in the 1860s, this was followed by the discovery of gold, In the 1860s was the discovery of diamonds, and in the 1880s was the discovery of gold and the setting up of this massive mining industry. But the way in which the British structured the mining industry was to use migrant labor. Instead of getting families to move to the industries, they recruited the men from the rural areas and they said, you leave your family behind and you come on your own. One of the objectives of that was actually to keep labor cheap, because the family was assumed to be paying for itself in the rural areas by pursuing agriculture. This, of course, was a myth, but that's what the British and the mining companies liked to believe, and that's how they behaved.
Was that accompanied by any significant industrial development?
Yes, it was accompanied. The first thing that happened was the establishment of the railways. Once the diamonds were discovered, remember the diamonds are way in the interior of the then Cape Colony, the British Cape Colony. So you had to build a railway line from the port, and the main port then was Cape Town. So a railway line from Cape Town to Kimberley had to be built. This was hundreds of kilometers. Now, to build a railway line, that's the beginning of industrialization. One of the interesting things about South Africa is that at about the same time as we were building railways in South Africa, the United States was doing the same. In the 1860s, they built what they called the transcontinental line railways from the east to the west, to California. So we more or less started industrializing South Africa and the United States at about the same time.
Was that industrialization related to mining, or was there a general development of small business, small industry that accompanied mining?
Well, there was a lot of other, for example, Kimberley is in the semi-arid part of South Africa. So there's very little agriculture to feed this huge population that gathered in Kimberley. So agriculture had to develop to feed that population. Interestingly, one of the main sources of food for Kimberley, for workers, came from Lesotho. That's where the Lesotho used to supply, especially wheat and so on. So agriculture was, so you had railway building, you had agriculture, then you had to build where people had to live. So a construction industry started, and so on. So and other furniture. Once you build a house, you have to have furniture in the house. So other industries started.
Tell us a bit about, and in summary, please, about the transfer of political power over this time, and what happened particularly in 1994.
Well, 1994 is, well, let's just take one step back. In the 19th century, political power in South Africa, in what was then South Africa, was controlled by the British primarily. The Boer republics were set up by the Boers, but these were very underdeveloped areas. So the main developed part of South Africa in terms of institutional development was the Cape Colony, which was controlled by the British. After the British, after a lot of conflicts with the people resident in the Cape and in South Africa, the native people, the Afrikaners, the British took over South Africa and established South Africa. So the state of South Africa was created by the British. And the state of South Africa was formalized in 1910 with the South Africa Act, passed by the House, by the British Parliament. So South Africa was created by the British and by the British Parliament. They handed power to the Afrikaans elite in 1910. The Afrikaans elite ruled South Africa until 1994. They had two parties, essentially. But anyway, they ruled South Africa until 1994. And they excluded the Africans and the African elite. And there was a lot of conflict, especially from the 1950s, over democratizing the political system. Eventually, this happened in 1994. So an African elite took over power in 1994.
You make a very important point in your book, which will become important later when we try and understand corruption and the state of the nation as it is now, its ranking in world economies. That elite that took over in 1994, was it linked to a substantial economic base?
No, this was one of the interesting things about South Africa, is that the African elite was relatively wealthy and owned property in the 19th century. So in the Cape, for example, You had Africans who were landowners, who bought land, who owned farms. And you had the Cape Constitution, which did not discriminate on the basis of race. Yeah, anyone who could write their name and had 25 pounds worth of fixed property could vote. So that was, and in Natal you had something similar, although the vote was never implemented. But the ownership of property was open to everyone there. What happened in the 20th century under the rule of the Afrikaner elite was that the Africans were dispossessed progressively. So by 1994, what had been in the 19th century and early 20th century a fairly prosperous African middle class had declined in terms of his property ownership. His property had been stripped off from them. They couldn't set up company, or all the things that we all know about the apartheid laws. So the new elite that took over power in 1994 had no property, had no assets. That was a characteristic.
And was not linked to a substantial economic base.
No, it had no economic base.
Now, you talk about a dangerous imbalance that is represented by what you have just described. The new political elite gaining state power, lacking an economic base. What result did that have for dependence on state resources, and what was the outcome of that in turn?
Well, it created a new dynamic. If you look at the Afrikaner elite were landowners, and they were farm owners. So they had conquered the land from the native population. They had conquered livestock from the native population. So when they came to power in 1910, they owned assets, which was land. And the land ownership, of course, by the Afrikaners went back to the 17th century with the establishment of the Western Cape colony by the Dutch East India Company. So you had a strong land-owning class, especially in the Cape, in Natal, and in the rest of South Africa. So they used the state to develop their property, their private property. For example, to develop agriculture. Our agriculture in the Highveld, which is where most of the grain for the South African population is grown, which is maize, was very underdeveloped in the 19th century. This was largely pastoral farming that was. So once the Afrikaner elite took over the government, they used the state to develop agriculture, summer rainfall agriculture. So they set up the University of Pretoria, for example. They set up veterinary medicine departments to look after the health of the cattle and of the sheep and so on. So they set up training centers to train the farmer, the Afrikaner farmer and his farm managers and his children and his family. They set up a communication infrastructure to get the food from the Platteland, as it's called, to the cities. So there's a huge infrastructure that was built during that time to make that property profitable and to supply the cities with food and agricultural products. The new African elite that took power, because it didn't have assets, it then lived off the state. So being a civil servant for them was a priority. So they took over the public service and they controlled the public service in the country. and they ratcheted up the salaries of the public service so that they can have the same consumption levels, the same standards of living as the white South Africans. But they use state revenue to do that rather than profit from their own assets, which is what the Afrikaner elite did.
So you have, after transition in 1994, a relatively small modern economy when seen against the background of the population of South Africa as a whole. Concentrated wealth in the hands of an elite, be that Afrikaner or black, and millions of the population dependent on the state for grants and services. It's described in the book as a stunted capitalist society.
Yes, it is, because the South African capitalist society, although it is capitalist, but it doesn't absorb the labor force. That's why we have 40% unemployment. If I can just illustrate this using the example of the United States. South Africa and the United States have an identical history. We were both, the United States was initially a Dutch settlement. What today is called New York used to be called New Amsterdam because it was set up by the Dutch initially. Anyway, the British took it over. So we have the same, it all happened in the 17th century. So South Africa and the United States have a very common history. We had slavery in South Africa. We had a free population from Europe, an enslaved population from Africa. We had genocide against the native people, and so on. So we have a very similar history. But today, the United States is the largest economy in the world, but South Africa is only a small middle income economy. So that one has to understand that dynamic about South Africa was that instead of developing like the United States, we became exporters of minerals instead of developing manufacturing industries like the United States did. What the United States and South Africa are both mineral-rich countries, so we had the same options. But the leaders of South Africa chose to use cheap, unskilled labor to mine and export raw materials. The Americans, you had to train their population to mine, yes, but to develop industry, to learn how to manufacture, how to process metals, how to make metals into tractors, into combine harvesters. So that's what happened between South Africa and the United States.
Talking about a concentration of wealth in an elite of whatever kind, a lack of industrial development across the nation, and a large population of unemployed dependent upon the state for welfare or for enrichment.
Yeah.
Yes. And you then talk about the ANC's political dilemma, the African National Congress, still the largest party, but prior to that the majority party. And you say that the ANC became trapped between poor voters demanding redistribution of wealth, labor unions demanding protection, and big business, the corporate elite, demanding stability.
Yeah.
What is this in its result?
Well, it's a formidable cocktail to manage. It's very difficult. It's a very unstable cocktail to have to manage. And clearly the ANC didn't have all the wherewithal to manage this very explosive mixture. that you have. There were all these demands on it, as you have outlined, but it couldn't manage them. And at the end, the voters said, this guy is useless, and they voted him out of office. South Africa is a very complex society with lots of interests, conflicting interests. And to manage it is very tough. To manage and to keep the system together is very difficult. And the ANC thought it could do it all by itself, and it failed. And the voters could see this guy failed. It was not industrializing the economy. If anything, the economy was deindustrializing under the ANC. The country was getting poorer. Unemployment was getting bigger and bigger. So that's why it got voted out. So you need a completely new way of managing South Africa from the way, first, let's start with the National Party. Remember, the National Party was in power from 1924 to 1994. It also couldn't manage this cocktail, and eventually it got kicked out. And then the ANC took over. It tried to manage the South African cocktail. It failed, and it got kicked out. Now the ANC is kept relevant in power by the Democratic Alliance. So now the Democratic Alliance is taking a huge gamble in propping up the ANC to continue with its failed policies.
That's an interesting point. But this cocktail that has not been properly managed, consumed or corrected, it has as a result, as you point out in the book, a vast sector of our population which is jobless and impoverished, and a lack of wealth creation outside of the state, because as you've pointed out, mining is no longer the wherewithal of our economy, certainly that it used to be. That makes the state the source of support by way of grant, or it makes the state a source of personal wealth creation and enrichment. How does that affect our future?
Well, it stunts our future. We are frozen because our economy, the private economy of South Africa, has to be taxed in order to finance the state and the redistribution to the poor and to the people working in the state. So what it does is it takes the profit that is made in the private sector, it taxes that, and then the state redistributes that to the poor as social welfare and to the civil service as salaries. So we have the highest paid civil service according to the International Monetary Fund. The civil service in South Africa takes up a huge part of our gross domestic product to enrich itself. So you are having the formal enrichment through this huge salary structure, which is approved by the parliament and all the rest of it. But you also have informal enrichment, which is corruption, which is now a very big problem in our economy.
We'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah, so that is the problem of having political power in the hands of people who don't have any private assets, is that they depend on state revenue, and then they have the political power to tax the rest of the population, and they have a decision, the power to decide how to redistribute that. So that is one of what I mean by the South African cocktail. It's it creates a lot of political instability. The Standard Bank did a survey a few, 3 or 4 years ago of 5 African countries. And they looked at the what they call high income earners, and to find out how did they make their money, what is their views on the stability of their country, and so on. These were South Africa, Mauritius, Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria in sub-Saharan Africa. The Standard Bank, in that survey, they found the country that was considered most unstable politically was actually South Africa.
One of the ways in which recognition has been given to the dilemma facing our rulers today, whether alone or in coalition, is to institute a system of black economic empowerment. I know this is a controversial topic which involves yourself and others. I don't want to stir the pot too much, but what is your view?
Well, you know who started black economic empowerment? It was actually the National Party. Many people think it was the ANC. Black economic empowerment was started by the National Party. And it used, the first instrument it used was Sanlam, the insurance company.
This was white economic empowerment.
No. This was black economic empowerment. In the early 90s, when the National Party realized it was going to lose power with the democratization process, it wanted to create a weakened state, a more weakened democratic state to protect its assets. So they wanted a weak state. And one of the instruments they used was to divide the black opposition. So they gave shares in a company called Metropolitan Life, which was part of Sanlam. They gave shares in that company to the leaders of the resistance in South Africa, who had been leading the resistance in the 70s, in the 80s, and the early 90s. They gave them shares, but only the Africans. But the resistance, as you recall, was multiracial. The United Democratic Front was African, colored, Indian, white. It was a huge unified resistance. But Sanlam and the National Party gave shares and money to the Africans only. I can give you the list of names of the people who got them. What that did was to weaken this multiracial coalition that had been fighting against apartheid. It divided them because now you left out the colors, you left out the whites, you left out the Indians. So they felt aggrieved and they stopped supporting the new governing party, which is how the DA got the vote of the colors and the Indians. So that's how black economic was started. That was the purpose of starting black economic empowerment. What has happened with black economic empowerment? I think even the National Party must, in its grave, it must be shocked by what has happened. Black economic empowerment has become a virus inside the body politics of South Africa because it benefits the African elite to the exclusion of everybody else, and it's one of the main drivers of corruption because now they are the ones who pass the laws that benefit themselves. They have the numbers. Remember, 80% of South Africa's population is African. And up to now, it has been led by the African middle class. So they have been passing the laws that benefit themselves. one aspect of this law is you set up a front company for a white company to pose as a black company. It's called fronting. So that's what black economic empowerment has become. It has become this virus in the body politic of South Africa, which drive all sorts of negative processes.
You've summarized this in your book to say that, and you've emphasized that today, to say that widespread and more than mining industrialization is important for the economic development of a society. You've stressed that our dependence on mining and perhaps finance too didn't have the best outcome for the development of our economy. Just a word, in the last 20 years, we've shut down technicons. Has that been a good thing?
No, it's been a bad thing. If you look at South Africa's human capital, what drives an economy in today's world, what drives an economy is not your minerals, it's not your natural resources, it's the skills of your population. If you look at the big companies today, that globally, who are the biggest companies today? They are skills-based companies. Like Elon Musk's electric vehicle company. That's an intellectual.
Asian giants.
It's the Asian giants, Alibaba. These are intellectually driven companies. Microsoft in America. These are companies that are driven by the skills of the population. South Africa, by depending on cheap, unskilled labor in the heart of its economy, which is agriculture and mining, doesn't have the skilled population. The World Bank does what they call the Human Capital Index. It measures how well countries use their human resources. Number one is Singapore. The last one they had was 170 countries, I think, in 2020. Anyway, number one is Singapore. Number two is Hong Kong. Number three is Japan. Number four is South Korea. Number five is Canada. Those are the top 5 countries in the world that have the most efficient use of their human capital, which means the highest education in their society. South Africa is number 132 in that list. We're number 10 below the African countries. Number 1 in Africa is Mauritius. In terms
we're
of
number 10 in that list.
we're number 10 in the list of African countries, behind Kenya, Egypt, Algeria, Zimbabwe, and so on. So that is South Africa. That's what's at the heart of our problem. We can't industrialize with that level of skills that we have. So we have to completely overhaul our education system and invest in education rather than investing in the salaries of the black elite in the public service.
I'm told, for example, that Australia places great priority on technical education in addition to traditional tertiary education.
Absolutely.
And we appear to be lacking. But that's a story perhaps for another day. Can I just make the observation that what has developed in our country, rooted in the history that you've outlined and dependent on those factors that you've outlined, is we've developed 2 economies. We have an illicit economy where for survival and for corrupt ends, people exploit state wealth. And we have a proper, legitimate economy, and I must say the line is not always that clear between them. As early as 1996, at the ANC conference, the dangers of corruption approaching our society, already existing in our society, were recognized. We haven't conquered that. In fact, it appears from your book and elsewhere that matters have gone worse, to the extent that we have two competing economies. Against that background, if we ask what can be done, and we now hopefully will speak to people who are in power or may come into power in the future. Your manifesto, your book advocates a number of important developments that must take place if we're going to rescue our country from the problems in which it finds itself. Industrial production, technical education, supporting entrepreneurship and small business, something that has been lacking, reducing dependence on patronage politics, which is, as you've pointed out, something that produces in turn corruption on a large scale, and reforming labour market rigidities, and therefore building a predominantly black productive middle class based on industry rather than political access. Is that a fair summary of your manifesto?
Yes, yes, it's a very good summary. You see, we have to, at the foundation of it is efficient use of your human resources instead of exploitation of your natural resources. That is the summary of what you've just said. But to have efficient use of your human resources, you have to invest in the skills of the human resources.
And create them in the first place.
Oh yeah, no, the people are there. The people are, actually, South Africans are quite creative. Just to give you an illustration, at one stage, China had 1 million students studying outside China because they realized they had to get the skills that the rest of the world, especially the Western world, had in order to develop China. They had to send 1 million students to go and study outside. Some of them were at the University of Pretoria because of its work on metals. The Chinese sent people to come and study at the University of Pretoria. And there were hundreds of thousands of them in the United States, in Western Europe. Today, China is the second largest economy in the world because it invested in the human capital of China. We have to do the same thing because it's no use us selling metals and raw materials. That doesn't give you the skills. You have to sell them, but you have to use that money not to pay a highly paid civil service, but to develop the skills of your young people, of your population.
You also stress in the book the need for stronger institutions. Clearly, what we have learnt recently through the Madlanga Commission is how weak our controls are merely to hold the society together, let alone to develop it in the way you suggest. You also stress the need for long-term planning and for a more, what you call, a meritocratic state. Would you like to talk about that a little?
Yes, you see, who controls the state and the politics is very critical. What happened in 1994 with the democratization of South Africa was that the people who control the assets, i.e. the capitalists, who were primarily white then, they got moved out of political power. So their asset became insecure because it was threatened. It's living under the threat of political power. So what you have to do in South Africa, you have to reintegrate back into political power the owners of capital. Now, the owners of capital, for their capital to grow and survive and be competitive, they need skilled workers. A middle class that is running the state like we are today is not interested in the skills of the population because they don't employ anyone. They are themselves employed. So this is a dynamic that has to change in South Africa. So the population, the voters have rejected the ANC because it has failed to develop the human capital of South Africa and therefore to develop the industries, which is why we're sitting with 40% unemployment. It has failed to do that. Again, going back to the United States, which develops its human capital, it only has 4% unemployment. And if you go to the Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia and so on, Malaysia has 3% unemployment because they develop their human capital. So we need a very radical political change in South Africa that transfers power from this middle class that is a consumer-oriented middle class to a new elite that includes the owners of capital who want to develop the productive capacity of the population, because they need the productive capital of the population to be able to make profit.
You've illustrated to us in your recital of the historical factors that have led us to our economic and political position today, and you've emphasized how dependence on state resources and the absence of industrial development have contributed to a reliance on state funds for survival and sometimes for enrichment. And sometimes the line between them is not very clear. That means that the corruption that we see today at the expense of the state primarily is rooted in the way our society is structured, and rooted in the way that it has developed over many, many years, but also since 1994, what has not been done in your view. So looking at corruption for a moment, I think any reasonable, sane citizen of South Africa will say corruption is bad. It's bad people doing bad things. But it seems from what you're saying, it needs more than effective law enforcement to address the problem. If we had effective law enforcement, it may make a difference, but I'm afraid that's a discussion for another day. Its effectiveness, and we are learning about that. What you're saying is if we're going to address issues like corruption in South Africa, we have to look at a far broader system of economic and political reform. And you've set out very neatly for us, and I must commend your books because it's very clearly set out there. I don't mean to be presumptuous, but they're worth the read. The question I have is, anybody listening? Are our leaders listening? Is civil society listening? Are our political leaders listening. Will the politicians save us? Do you have hope?
Now, I have lots of hope. Lots of people are listening. The churches, for example, now the churches in South Africa, first, are very trusted by the population. Secondly, they have a huge number of people as members of the churches. I have been asked by the church organizations to do my presentations about the weaknesses of our economy and the problems of corruption, as well as what needs to be done. And one of the things that the churches have done, they have set up what they call a churches and business working group, because they realize that they need to work with the business community to try and sort out the problems of South Africa, the churches themselves. They realize that the political parties have failed. They've had 30-year run of a democratic system, and they have failed. They have failed the country, and they've failed the people, and they have enriched themselves. So the churches are now beginning to intervene. The businesses themselves, they are now intervening. They are saying that we have to make the railways run. We have to intervene and make the railways run ourselves, because it's undermining the economy of South Africa. We can't get goods from the interior to the ports and from the ports to the interior because of corruption and incompetence and everything of the state that is running the railways. South African Airways has collapsed. South African Airways used to be one of the best airlines in Africa. It's totally collapsed. Kenya Airways, Ethiopian Airlines are the main airlines in Africa today. And South African Airways has collapsed in the hands of the new political rulers in South Africa. And I can go on and mention other things. Our municipalities don't work, which we need for the welfare of the population and for the functioning of industry.
Education system.
And our education system. You need the municipalities. To drive from my office to here, I have to go through so many potholes. So this is what the failure of the democratic government up to now has entailed for South Africa. So we need a real change in this country, and I'm optimistic that it will happen.
We have a plethora of small parties. There is no certain front runner apart from the largest political party, the ANC, at the moment. But it doesn't appear to the ordinary observer reading social media, reading the newspapers, that the ideas that you put forward in your book have taken root, that we're talking seriously beyond the more superficial contestation between the political parties of a new plan to address the types of historically rooted but current problems that we have.
Yes, part of it is the electoral laws that we have in South Africa. The South African government is very unaccountable to the citizens. And the proportional representation system of choosing members of parliament encourages the proliferation of small parties. So it's not small parties haven't got the capacity to produce new ideas. They haven't got the numbers, but they have 2 or 3 or 4 members of parliament. So you have this proliferation of small parties which add no value to our political system. So we need to reform our political system. And this was agreed in the discussions about the new constitution way back in the 1990s. But the ANC has been opposing the introduction of constituencies where members of parliament are accountable to the people in a constituency. So this is one of our problems, is that we have an unaccountable government. The politicians are accountable to other politicians. They are not accountable to the voters. And these are the drivers of corruption and all those things, because the politicians are not accountable to anyone.
You've illustrated reasonably clearly to us over the last hour the system, political, economic, industrial, that has given rise to the current problems that we face today, of which corruption is at the forefront, I would say. What harm does corruption do to our country, and how can we deal with it? I know that's a week-long discussion, but if you can summarize.
It does enormous damage, corruption. Resources that are supposed to go, for example, to education, to hospital maintenance, to look, are stolen or expropriated by the bureaucracy, essentially. And then the health of the people suffers.
Then you still have to pay for law enforcement.
Okay. Oh, yeah, law enforcement, but law enforcement is compromised, as we are learning from the Matlanga Commission. They are not enforcing the law. Many of them are enriching themselves. The railways are not functioning because the resources that are supposed, if you look at the procurement of railway locomotives, yes, there was supposed to be a procurement of over 1,000 locomotives from China by Transnet. This whole thing is riddled with corruption. The consequence, in fact, if you look at the financial, at Business Day today, it shows how much of our freight, which should be going on the railways, is going on the roads because of corruption in the management of the railway infrastructure. The cost of corruption is huge to the economy, to the health of the people, to the education of the people, which is why those who are in the middle class get their health services from the private sector.
The analysis has been instructive. In the short term, there are various solutions proffered. I'm not sure that there are any constructive long-term solutions actually being implemented now. But what you have illustrated clearly is that we're in it for the long haul. We need redevelopment, we need reconcentration of resources in industrialization, we need education, we need to deal with corruption. All those things will take time. In the short term, what can be done about corruption and the problems that you've...
Well, in the short term, we have to clean up our police and enforcement agents. That can be done in the short term. For example, the scorpions. Why aren't we bringing back the structure of the scorpion? This was a ready-made formula which gave us the scorpions, which is who caught the corruption in the so-called state capture era. It was the scorpions. Of course, Jacob Zuma and his bunch of merry men, when they got into control of the state, they abolished the scorpions. Well, let's bring them back. They were an agency that was effective. In their architecture, there was something. Remember, the scorpions were not just thumb-sucked. They were a result of work between our own security experts, the American security experts, the British, which produced the scorpions. So that's a short-term rebuild the scorpions, get rid of the hawks. The hawks are part of the corruption process. Get rid of the hawks, bring back the scorpions with the legal framework that the scorpions said, so they are not accountable to the police. Yes, so that whole structure, so there are short-term things that can be done in the here and now.
So to summarize, there are short-term things that can and should be done as a matter of urgency, as I hear you emphasize. We must look at civil society. You gave the example of the churches. Those instruments must be put in place. Those initiatives must have the support of our populace. But ultimately, there's a long-term restructuring solution that must be considered, developed, and put in place. You have hope?
Yes, I have lots of hope. It will happen. It has happened in other countries.
Yes. Well, I hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you for watching the first in our series of podcasts. Under the heading Help Us Understand, Moeletsi has helped us understand over a vast range of topics. We seek to move beyond current social media and its adversarial nature, which, as was confirmed earlier, inhibits proper understanding, inhibits problem solving. So be with us for the next time.